So I am on notes 6.6, which is entitled Phase Shift. And the book sometimes uses different forms of the same equation. So I put these two forms up here, but I wanted you to kind of break them down with me and realize some things. The first thing is that whether we're graphing sines or cosines today, we're going to have that coefficient of A. So A, as we know, is the amplitude. And so when I'm graphing, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm kind of listing the attributes is say what A is. So A, in these forms, A is the amplitude or the height. And don't forget, there's a very important detail about A, and that's if A is less than 0, we are going to flip that graph. The next thing we look at is that B number. B has an effect on the period, how long it takes to repeat. So the next thing I want to always list is what is the period? So the period is 2 pi over B, and that's for the sine, the cosine, the cosecant, and the secant. For sine, cosine, cosecant, and secant, the period is 2 pi over B. So I always start with 2 pi over B because you guys, even when I was graphing tangent the other day, and I hope you had a chance to kind of look at that video when I did these tangents with you, but even when I did the tangent, I looked at 2 pi over B because I don't actually consider this as graphing tangent. In the beginning, I consider, oh, let's graph cosine. Let's graph cosine. So I always use 2 pi over B. At the end for tangent and cotangent, we ended up getting 2 periods. This graph looks the same as this graph. So we end up having 2 periods of tangent graphed at the end. All right, so I'm always going to use 2 pi over B for the period, unless I was to dive right in and think about tangent, cotangent, and then it's more pi over B. Then finally, we learned about that D number off of the end, but I hate that they called that D in the book. What I prefer them call it is K. Let's call it what it is. So my preference is just to call it K because that's what we call it throughout the entire first semester. The number hanging off the end, that number that they called D there, I'm going to call it K because that's your vertical shift. Up and down. These are all the numbers we've learned about so far. And today the learning target is the phase shift. So the phase shift is this number C inside of the parentheses. So they call it C. I don't like that they called it C. I prefer to call it H, and that is that phase shift. Now they call it phase shift for trig graphs. You can also call it a horizontal shift like we do first semester. And there's a warning. I'm going to actually put a little bit of a warning here, a big old star. And I bet you know what if it's negative, if it's a minus sign, it moves to the right. And if it's a plus sign, then it moves to the left because that would mean that the C number itself was negative. So I'm going to put a big old warning here that we're going to have to go in the opposite direction of the sign. Big old warning. If it's a minus, you're going to actually go to the right. And if it's a plus, you're going to go to the left. Good job. Thank you for giving me that warning in the chat. So let's tackle some of these. Here we go. We've got an A, we've got the period, we've got a K, and we've got an H today. Example 1 has an issue right away. Example 1 does not fit the form above because of this darn old 2 that they put inside of the parentheses. Our book insists on doing this. It's causing us extra work. So this guy right here is going to get a warning also. That number B cannot be inside of the parentheses in our general form that we have above. So what I have to do is I have to factor that out. I need to rewrite this. I'm going to rewrite this equation with this 2 factored out front. Now, if I factor out the 2, I have to divide by 2 here and divide by 2 here. So I'm going to get my equation now fitting the form to be y equals 3 times the sine of 2 times the quantity x minus pi halves. So watch out. If they misplace that b, don't get tricked. You're going to say, oh, wait. I got to factor that out, which means I need to divide this number by that 2. Notice the number hanging off the end is just a 0. Sometimes I like to write that in just because now I'm going to list all of the attributes. And I know some of you didn't do this necessarily on the quiz as I'm starting to grade them, but on the test, please try your best to list everything. That way I can go through quickly and say yes, they did it great. They knew everything that we were talking about. So I'm going to list everything. The amplitude is 3. That's that coefficient to the sine. The period is 2 pi over b. So in that case, that's 2 pi over that number 2 that I factored out. So the period is going to be pi. The vertical shift up and down is the k number. So you can write k equals, or if you want to actually call it like vs for vertical shift, it doesn't matter to me what you call it. That k number is just 0. There is no shift up or down. I don't need that new k line. And now brand new is this number in the parentheses. And notice it's x minus pi halves, which means that the h number, so I'm going to write h equals, h number is a positive pi halves. You can call it h, you could call it phase shift if you want to. That's what they call it for the learning target, phase shift, PS. But either way, it's pi halves. Now, I actually, because I can mess this up often, there's so much going on, I actually like to tell my brain pi halves right. So I actually like to write the word right, telling myself a direction. Now, what has changed? What's changed is that I'm no longer starting on my y-axis. I'm going to start now pi halves units to the right. And because of that, I'm actually not going to draw my y-axis. This is hard because I'm just in a habit of okay, here's my x-axis and here's my y-axis. But stop yourself from drawing that y-axis. I actually don't know where the y-axis is going to fall yet. So hold off on writing your y-axis. Instead, let's start at a little tick mark here. This is going to be my start. Let's start pi halves to the right. No longer do we start at the y-axis. We're going to start at pi halves. So I'm actually going to put a little star here, and I'm going to remind you that we start at the phase shift. Start at PS. And actually, I'm actually going to tell my brain, okay, right here is where I'm going to start. Now, you don't have to write all of that, but this is the first time we're doing this, so I want to kind of talk you through what my brain is thinking. Okay, so somebody just asked, wouldn't it be pi halves left? So I want to talk about that. Let's make that very clear. So in this form, it's x minus the number c. And the number c, oopsies, there we go, x minus the number c, and the number c is the phase shift. So if I look at what's happening here, it's x minus the number c. This number is c. So pi halves is c, meaning that that's pi halves to the right. That's why I always say it's kind of opposite. It's opposite direction of the sign. So if it's x minus pi halves, you actually shift to the right. If it was x plus pi halves, then that would be like an x minus a negative pi halves, so that would shift to left. So a plus sign shifts left and a minus sign shifts right. It's all backwards. Okay, thanks for letting me know that you got that. Big moment. Okay, if you tuned out on me just for a moment, if you tuned out, tune back in. This is, I think, one of the hardest parts about a phase shift. Phase shift gets its own day because there's so many challenges to it. Here it comes. I'm going to start at pi halves. Now, I'm going to end a full period later. So what I need to do here is from the start, I need to add the period to that. And if I add the period, I can figure out, well, where then does the 1 period graph end? So there's going to be a lot of fraction skills work in here because I'm starting at pi halves. And I need to add the period, which is pi. So I need to think about what's pi halves plus pi. I can get a common denominator, and that's pi halves plus 2 pi halves. So I know, well, a half pi plus a full pi is 3 pi over 2. So that's how I figure out where to end. So we start at PS, that's my little star note there, and we're going to end at whatever the phase shift is plus the period. Start at the phase shift and end at the phase shift plus the period. Okay, that's the number one challenging thing to get started on the right foot. And the next challenge, oh my gosh, we have to find the little tick marks in between. We have to split this now into 4 chunks. The key to doing that in my head is the game of averages. Like I need to figure out what's right between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. So I need to figure out how to average these numbers together. So to average numbers, if I'm going to average 2 numbers, I am going to just add them and divide by how many there are, which would be 2. Like if you said to me, oh, I got a 90% of my first test and 100% of my second test, and you want to know what's the average, you would do 90 plus 100 and divide by 2. You add them together and divide by 2. So I'm going to add these numbers to get 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi, and then cut it in half to get pi. This number here is pi. I hope that makes sense. I mean, I feel like you guys would not even have to do any math to know, well, between a half and 1.5 would be 1 pi. But now we get to do it again. Like I need to know this number here. And this is the average between these 2 numbers. Okay, so let's think about that. This number here, if I get a common denominator, was 2 pi over 2. So let's add these numbers to get 3 pi over 2. Now we have to cut that in half to get 3 pi over 4. In the past, this has been the biggest challenge for my students, and it's all based on those 5th grade fraction skills. Gosh, it's a long time to go. We have to figure out what that number is. Okay, well, we have to add these fractions together. So let's add these numbers together. I'm going to add them to get a let's see, 5 pi over 2, but then we have to cut it in half or double the denominator. So I'm going to get 5 pi over 4. I'm doing a dramatic pause here to see if I have any questions. That is the most challenging part about today. Working with those fractions and figuring out how to label those. Yep, somebody asked me to do it again. Absolutely, you got it. Thank you for asking. Okay, so to figure out what's in between, what's the average, I'm going to add these together and then divide by 2. When I average 2 numbers, I add them and divide by 2. So pi is the same thing as 2 pi over 2. I like to get a common denominator. So let's add these together to get 5 pi over 2. But then we need half of that. We need to cut it in half, divide by 2. When you take half of something, you double the denominator. So I added them to get 5 pi over 2. When I multiply that by 1/2, I'll get 5 pi over 4. We're going to practice again in the next example. Okay, the last thing, guys, is where in the world does my y-axis land? Because I do need a y-axis when I'm graphing. So I have to figure out, like, where would it make sense to put my y-axis? So if you see that each of these steps is 1/4 of a pi, right? From 3/4 to pi is 1/4, another quarter of a step. So from pi over 2, I should step 2 of those quarters. So my y-axis really should be 2 steps to the left. I am not going to be picky about like your spacing and all of that. So just as long as you understand that, okay, yeah, this y-axis should be further to the left. And now on the y-axis, I'll list the amplitude, which is 3. So my top is 3 and my bottom is -3. And finally, I need to go to graph the sign, middle, top, middle, bottom, middle. But remember to start here. Remember to start here. So I'm going to go middle at pi over 2, middle, top, middle, bottom, middle, just like that. Phase shift. Woo! Makes us think. Yes, it says, can you please explain why you put the y-axis 2 away again? Sure. And again, I just want you to know I'm not going to be really that picky about the y-axis in terms of, oh, it should be a little bit further, no, a little bit closer. Let me talk to you about what's happening here in these steps. So see, to get from 3 pi over 4 to pi, I step 1/4 of a pi. And then to get from pi to 5 pi over 4, I step 1/4 of a pi. And then here, 1/4 of a pi. So each of these steps is 1/4 of a pi. So from 1/2 of a pi, I would need to step 1/4 of a pi. So this guy right here would be like pi over 4. And then another 1/4 of a pi to get to 0. Remember, your y-axis is located at 0. So you're really trying to figure out, like, where does it make sense that 0 should fall? Where does it make sense? Because this, if I were to label this, right, I'd put a little 0 there. The y-axis lands at 0. Okay, you're welcome. Again, I just want to reiterate, like, had you written it here, I'm not going to be like, oh, man, I don't know. I'm not going to look that closely. Okay, let's try it again. This is the last graph that we'll do together, and then we're going to do one where we write the equation. So first things first, hopefully you're going to see, oh, they're being mean right here. Be careful, be careful. That 4 is misplaced, so we need to factor out that 4. So careful, warning, we'll divide by 4 and we'll divide by 4 so that we rewrite this guy. So I'm going to rewrite him as y equals 2 times the cosine of 4 outside as my b, and then my x plus 3 pi over 4. Okay, as soon as I have that, now I want you guys to be diligent about, like, writing down all of the details. That's really because if you make a mistake, I can give you a whole bunch of partial credit that way. So as you're writing down your details, your height is going to be a 2. I don't need a flip. Thank goodness, there's enough to think about. The period is going to be 2 pi over b, which was 4. So that's going to be pi halves. The vertical shift, the k, I mean, if you want to put a plus a 0 on the outside, you can. Just to remind yourself that, hey, there is no vertical shift. One last thing to think about again. You can call it a vertical shift or k, it doesn't matter to me. And then the brand new piece. The brand new piece is going to be that phase shift. So tell me in the chat here, am I going to go left or right? Correct the phase shift. Now you can call it PS, or I like to call it H, because that's what we call it first semester. Is going to be a negative 3 pi fourths, or I actually like to write 3 pi fourths left. That one actually tell my brain, okay, don't forget I'm going to the left. Here we go. Let's actually graph this guy. Now, my habit, I almost just did it. My habit is to draw my y-axis and my x-axis. Don't do it. Just draw your x-axis. We'll figure out then where the y-axis falls. So here I'm going to start at a negative 3 pi over 4. So when I label this, the leftmost point, that's negative 3 pi fourths, I'm going to tell my brain, okay, start here at negative 3 pi fourths. I know somebody admitted to writing their y-axis in the chat. I'm bad at it. I'm bad at it too. And I get so nervous because I'm using marker, whereas when I do homework, I use pencil. But okay, so yeah. Erase, erase. So I'm going to start at negative 3 pi fourths. Now I'm going to add a full period. So this number here, the start plus the period, is going to determine where I end. So I need to do a negative 3 pi fourths plus the period, which was pi halves. So I'm adding the period to get to the end. Let's see, this takes a little bit of fraction skills. Negative 3 pi fourths plus times 2, so 2 pi fourths. And I will get negative pi fourths. All right, guys, it's up to you. I'm looking for 3 numbers in the chat from left to right. Go ahead, find each of these numbers and then pop them in the chat. This number, that number, that number. We're going to add these together. Okay, when I add negative 3 pi fourths and negative pi fourths, I get a negative 4 pi fourths, which is just a negative pi. And I'm going to cut it in half to get negative pi over 2. So you have to average them, so you add them and divide by 2. Now, when I'm doing that, I do like to give myself kind of a little note here what the common denominator is. So that's negative pi halves or negative 2 pi fourths. And if you labeled it as negative 2 pi fourths, I'm not going to take off for that. But I like to write it there because now I'm going to average these. So we add these together to get negative 5 pi fourths, but we cut that in half to get negative 5 pi eighths. I'm going to do it again. So I'm going to add these together to get negative 3 pi fourths. I'm going to cut it in half to get negative 3 pi eighths. At this point, I'm ready to determine where is my y-axis? Like, where should I put it? Where should I put it? So I'm going to figure out where to put it. And I can see that, oh my gosh, look at the quarter of a step is like 2 notches. That would be a quarter, and that would be a quarter. So, you know, a quarter of a step, and kind of see that they're actually stepping an eighth of a step. I'm not going to be that picky, but numerically it should kind of make sense. Somebody said, how did I get the middle number? So I added these two on the ends, the start and the end. Add these together to get negative 4 pi fourths, which, by the way, is just negative pi, because you can reduce it. Add them and then divide by 2. So that's how I get negative pi over 2. Either way, these are all negative numbers, so I know my y-axis is going to land to the right side. And that's as picky as I'm going to be. Like, did you put it to the right, to the left, in between? Where does it go? And I'm going to label my amplitude as 2. So up 2 and down 2, and I'm ready to go. So I'm going to start, this is cosine, at the top. Top, middle, bottom, middle, top. So at my starting here, I'm starting at the top, then the middle, then the bottom, then the middle, and finally the top. Just like this. All right, we did it. Now the last one's super quick. The last one, they're going to give you the attributes, and they want you to write the equation. So let's wrap it up here in the last 5 minutes with one last example. One last example here. On this one, they want me to write a sine equation. So write the equation of a sine function. And then they tell me all of the attributes. So let's look. They're telling me that the amplitude is 3. So all right, I'm already knowing that A is 3. Now they tell me that the period is pi over 2. But I need to know what B is, not what the period is. So I actually have to do a little bit of a calculation or a little bit of thinking here. The period is 2 pi over B. So they're telling me 2 pi over B is equal to pi over 2. I'm hoping you can just look at that and know what B is. But if not, you certainly could cross multiply to figure out what B is. That works as well. So you can see that when you divide both sides by pi, that 4 is equal to B. Or it makes sense. Pi over 2 is the same thing as 2 pi over 4. So A is 3, B is 4. And they told me a phase shift, so that's my H number, or my PS is 2. And they didn't give me a K, so I know K is 0. Now there's one little piece that's a little bit mean here, so let's talk about it. If I were to now use these 3 pieces and write my equation, I would say y equals A, so 3. They told me to write it in terms of a sine of B outside of the parentheses. And then x minus h, so x minus 2. And for me, I'd be like, oh, mic drop, done, good, out of here. But this book specifically wants me to put the omega, or that number, inside. Okay, so one final step. Since they want that number inside, then I do have to distribute this, which is going to affect this number here. That's why they call it theta, not b. So finally, y equals 3 times the sine of 4x minus 8, final answer.